In June of 1995, a 32-foot statue of Michael Jackson was floated down the Thames River in London. He was dressed like a general, fists clenched, a bandolier across his chest. His face pointed toward the sky like he was watching an empire that hadn't arrived yet. There were 9 of these statues, steel and fiberglass, each one weighing over 2 tons. Sony spent $30 million putting them in cities across Europe, and almost every newspaper that covered it used the same word: ego. But here's what almost nobody asked in 1995. Why a general? Why that pose? Why did Jackson specifically request a statue of me when Sony asked how he wanted to promote his next album? Because that statue wasn't random, and it wasn't the only time this happened. Michael Jackson spent 2 decades quietly building real historical and military symbolism into his videos, his album covers, and even his own home. And most of it went right over the heads of the people covering him. This video is going to walk you through 7 of those moments. Some of them critics got completely wrong in real time. One of them, buried in his own living room, is stranger than anything that ever made it into a music video. Let's start with the statues, and the comparison almost nobody wants to bring up anymore. Coincidence. Number 1, the statue that critics compared to Nazi propaganda. When Sony unveiled the History album campaign, the marketing wasn't just the statues. There was also a 4-minute promotional film, and it was built like a military newsreel. Soldiers in brown uniforms marching in formation, red banners, stone columns straight out of a fascist rally. And, at the front of it all, Michael Jackson, in an armband, waving to a crowd like a head of state. Watch it today, and it's uncomfortable. Watch it in 1995, and at least one Stanford professor said so publicly, comparing the visual language directly to the propaganda films made in the 1930s to sell dictators to their own people. But here's what most people never saw at the time. Jackson wasn't hiding from that comparison. In some ways, he seemed to want people to feel it. He told Diane Sawyer, on camera, that he knew the statues would generate backlash, and that he was satisfied it worked exactly the way he planned. This is where the story changes, because if you only look at the statue, it reads as arrogance, a pop star turning himself into a monument. But if you look at what album this was attached to, the picture gets more complicated. History was the record where Jackson was writing directly about persecution, about being falsely accused, about being hunted by tabloids, about feeling like the voice of the accused and the attacked, as he put it in one interview defending the album's content. He wasn't just building a monument to fame. He was building a monument to survival, using the visual grammar of power because he felt powerless. And here's the detail that changes everything. Those statues are still standing. Right now, in 2026, at least one of them sits in an abandoned nightclub courtyard in Austria. Another has been spotted in the Netherlands. Decades later, people are still trying to sell them. A $30 million campaign built on imagery so loaded that a university professor publicly flagged it as propaganda. And it's still out there in the world today, half forgotten, half immortal. Think about the sheer scale of what actually happened here. 9 statues, 32 feet tall, 4,000 pounds each. A construction crane lowering one into a public square in Berlin, of all cities. A team of 30 people building them non-stop for 3 months. That's not the kind of effort someone puts into a joke. That's the kind of effort someone puts into a message they desperately need people to see, even if they can't say it outright. That's coincidence number 1, but it's not even the strangest use of military imagery in his career. Coincidence number 2. The uniforms were built from real kings, not costumes. Here's something almost nobody outside his inner circle knew for years. Michael Jackson's military jackets, the gold braid, the epaulettes, the medals, weren't designed off a costume rack. They were researched. His longtime costume designer, Michael Bush, later revealed that when they were building Jackson's stage wardrobe, they didn't just sketch something dramatic and call it done. They studied European military history. They studied actual monarchs. One king in particular came up again and again in that research, Henry VIII of England. One of the most infamous and image-obsessed rulers in European history, a man who used clothing as a weapon of intimidation centuries before Jackson was born. And it goes further than that. After Jackson received the Entertainer of the Decade Award at the White House in 1990, he didn't just want a nice jacket. He showed his designers a photograph of the Queen of England's imperial state crown, the actual crown, kept in the Tower of London, and sent them to study it in person. They came back and hand-built a sterling silver crown, encrusted with stones, to match it. But here's the part critics almost always missed. To most reporters watching from the outside, this looked like costume excess. Just another eccentric outfit from Wacko Jacko, as the tabloids loved to call him. What they were actually looking at was a performer engineering himself, piece by piece, out of the literal visual language of European monarchy, the same imagery kings and queens used for hundreds of years to project untouchable authority. Jackson once said something simple about why he wore a uniform in the first place. A uniform commands attention. That's it. That's the whole philosophy. He wasn't playing dress up. He was building armor out of history. The same instinct, in a different form, that put him inside those 30-foot statues. And it explained something that took most critics years to catch up on. This wasn't a man randomly obsessed with shiny jackets. This was a performer who understood, on a historical level, exactly how emperors and kings had always dressed to be remembered, and who applied that same formula to pop music. There's one more detail worth sitting with here. Jackson reportedly told his designers that if the average person in the front row could afford to wear the exact same outfit he had on, he'd stop being an entertainer. The whole point of the uniform was distance, untouchability. The same psychological trick monarchs used for centuries. Dress so far above the crowd that the crowd starts to believe you actually are above them. That black and gold jacket from the Bad Tour, the one he wore jumping out onto the Super Bowl stage in 1993. That same design was later turned into a statue and put on the cover of a history. One outfit recycled across an entire decade, slowly transforming from a stage costume into a monument. Now here's where it gets even stranger, because military history wasn't the only thing he was quietly encoding into his art. Ancient history was next. Coincidence. Number 3. The Egypt video Hollywood refused to make. In 1992, Jackson released the music video for Remember the Time, 9 minutes long, set entirely in ancient Egypt. Eddie Murphy as the pharaoh, Iman as the queen, Magic Johnson in a cameo appearance. At the time, most reviews focused on the special effects, Jackson turning into sand, the elaborate choreography, the gold costumes. But here's what almost never made it into the coverage. This video wasn't supposed to be a music video at all. It was originally pitched as a full feature film, and according to the director, John Singleton, major studio executives, including names as big as Steven Spielberg, passed on it. Why? Because the film insisted on something Hollywood historically avoided, an entirely black cast portraying ancient Egyptian royalty. Jackson didn't drop the idea. He self-financed the project as a short film instead, and Singleton required an all-black cast and crew from top to bottom. This is where the story changes again. Because Remember the Time wasn't just a love song with a fancy backdrop. It landed directly in the middle of a real historical argument, one that historians and Egyptologists still debate today, about the ethnicity of ancient Egyptian royalty and whether that history had been quietly whitewashed by decades of Hollywood biblical epics that cast white actors as pharaohs and queens. Jackson's costume in the video wasn't randomly designed either. The gold chest piece he wore was modeled directly after the one worn by Yul Brynner playing Rameses II in the Ten Commandments. Except this time, an African-American man was standing where Hollywood had always put someone else. Critics at the time mostly praised it as a visually stunning comeback single. Almost none of them clocked that Jackson had just self-funded a direct rebuttal to decades of Hollywood casting, wrapped inside a 9-minute pop video, using the most expensive and elaborate ancient history set piece MTV had ever aired. That's 3 coincidences down. But the fourth one is hiding in plain sight, on an album cover 40 million people owned. Coincidence number 4, the album cover, with a hidden autobiography painted into it. Look at the cover of Dangerous, released in 1991, and at first glance it just looks strange. Circus imagery, a masked face, animals everywhere. But here's what most people never noticed, because you genuinely cannot see it on a small CD case. The artist Mark Ryden spent 6 months hand-painting that cover, and he packed it with layers of hidden narrative most fans never fully unpacked. There's a reference to P.T. Barnum, the founder of the circus, worked directly into the foreground. There are gears turning inside a queen's gown, which some analysts have connected to Charlie Chaplin's 1936 film about industrialization and dehumanized labor. There's an entire upside-down industrial world in one corner, echoing the visual style of the classic dystopian film Metropolis. And this is the part nobody explains in most interviews about the cover. Buried in the corners of that painting are 2 different versions of Michael Jackson himself. One as a child star, one as an adult during the Thriller years, placed near a skeleton near a young Macaulay Culkin, near symbols of adventure and symbols of danger. Jackson gave Ryden almost no restrictions. His only instruction, according to the artist, was that the design should be mysterious enough that people would interpret it in their own way. Ryden has been called the godfather of a whole art movement, and critics have since ranked the Dangerous cover alongside the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's as one of the most intricate album covers ever produced. But unlike Sgt. Pepper's, which mostly celebrates cultural icons, The dangerous cover is closer to a confession. Animals that represent his real pets, children that echo his own lost childhood, danger and wonder painted side by side. Think about that for a second. A global pop star, at the absolute peak of his career, handed an artist creative freedom specifically so the meaning would stay ambiguous, so that 30 years later, people would still be arguing over what it means. Most album covers are marketing. This one was closer to a diary, written in symbols instead of words, hidden in plain sight on top 40 shelves in every mall in America. And the deeper you look, the more you realize this pattern keeps repeating. Symbols hiding real meaning most people never had the patience or the historical context to actually decode. Which brings us to the most controversial 4 minutes of his entire career. Coincidence number 5. The band ending that was timed to a real riot. Black or White, premiered in November of 1991 to an estimated 500 million viewers, still one of the largest audiences for a single piece of television in history. Most people remember the fun part, the face morphing, the dancing around the world. Almost nobody talks about what happened in the final 4 minutes because it got pulled from broadcast almost immediately. In the uncut ending, Jackson transforms into a Black Panther, prowls through an empty city street, and then transforms back into himself, smashing car windows, destroying a storefront, and causing a building marked Royal Arms to explode. Parents' groups were furious. Networks pulled the segment within a day. But here's what most people never connected at the time. This sequence was filmed in the exact window of time between the videotaped beating of Rodney King and the Los Angeles riots that followed the officer's acquittal. Jackson said, years later, in a 1999 interview, that the entire sequence was his attempt to physically express his frustration with racial injustice in America, using dance instead of words. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable, and this is the part that even longtime fans argue about. The original cut carried no explicit racial message. It was abstract. A man becoming an animal, releasing rage into an empty city. So 2 years later, in 1993, Jackson had the footage digitally altered. Racist graffiti and hate slurs were added onto the smashed windows in the re-release, messages that were never part of the original broadcast, apparently to retroactively make his intentions clearer. Instead, it did the opposite. It confused critics further and gave outlets another reason to paint him as unstable rather than political. A performer trying to make a statement about racism ended up altering his own art in a way that made the statement harder to read, not easier. That's 5 coincidences in. But the 6th one might be the most personal thing he ever put on camera, and almost nobody watching it in 1997 understood what they were actually seeing. Coincidence number 6, the horror movie that was actually a confession. In 1997, Jackson released a 40-minute short film called Ghosts, co-written with Stephen King. On the surface, it's simple. A mysterious magician called the Maestro, played by Jackson, lives alone in a mansion outside a small town. He entertains local children with magic tricks. One night, a boy tells his mother about the visits. The town mayor, also played by Jackson, leads an angry mob with torches to drive the Maestro out. Critics at the time mostly called it bloated and strange. One review described it as clunky and overblown. Here's a detail that makes the timing even stranger. This project actually started years earlier, in 1993, as a much lighter idea, a music video meant to promote a comedy film. Production stopped cold the moment the molestation allegations became public that same year. It sat unfinished for 3 years. Then, once the case was settled, Jackson picked the project back up, rewrote it with King into something much darker, and gave it an ending nobody was expecting from what started as a lighthearted concept. But here's the part. Almost no review from that era actually said out loud. This film was written and shot in the direct aftermath of the 1993 child molestation allegations against Jackson, allegations that were settled out of court and never led to criminal charges, but that permanently changed how the public saw him. In the film, one boy tells the mob, "He hasn't hurt anybody, couldn't we just go?" Another child fires back, blaming him for even speaking up at all. That's not incidental dialogue. That's Jackson, through Stephen King's script, restaging his own scandal, the accusation, the mob, the judgment, as a monster movie, and casting himself as both the persecuted outsider and the very authority figure leading the persecution. This is the part that most people never explain when they talk about Ghosts. It wasn't just a Halloween special. It was Jackson using the exact tools he understood best, costumes, symbolism, spectacle, to process the worst year of his public life in front of an audience of children, the same audience the allegations were about. Whether you find that brave or deeply unsettling depends entirely on what you already believe about Michael Jackson. But either way, it's one of the strangest pieces of autobiographical filmmaking a mainstream pop star has ever released, and almost nobody watching it as a kid in 1997 had any idea that's what they were looking at. 6 coincidences down. But we saved the strangest one for last, and it never appeared in a single music video. Coincidence. Number 7. The Napoleon statue. Nobody talks about inside Neverland Ranch, in Jackson's actual living space, sat a massive bronze statue. It was a recreation of one of the most famous paintings in French history, Jacques-Louis David's portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte, rearing on a horse, cape billowing, one arm raised toward the sky, a cannon at his feet. The exact image used for centuries to symbolize Napoleon's conquest of Europe. Jackson didn't just admire the painting, he had it turned into a life-sized bronze monument and placed it inside his own home. And that wasn't an isolated piece. Over the years, Jackson commissioned dozens of portraits of himself, painted by multiple different artists, that placed him inside the exact visual world of European monarchy. Jackson posed in a suit of armor, angel wings behind him, surrounded by children reaching toward the sky. Murals 15 feet tall showing him as a knight. Portraits echoing the formal opulent style used for centuries to paint kings. One of his favorite artists later said that Jackson referred to Michelangelo, the man who painted the Sistine Chapel and sculpted some of the most famous royal and religious figures in history, as his favorite artist of all time. Now, pay attention, because this is the detail that pulls every single coincidence in this video together. The military statues built like a general's monument, the uniforms researched from real kings, the Egyptian pharaoh imagery, the circus painting hiding an autobiography, the Panther dance timed to a real riot, the horror film disguised as a confession. And now quietly, in his own private home away from cameras and critics entirely, a bronze Napoleon and a gallery of himself painted as royalty. This wasn't a performer occasionally borrowing historical costumes for shock value. This was a man who, in his most guarded and private moments, kept surrounding himself with the exact same imagery he used publicly. Kings, generals, empires, monuments built to outlast a single human lifetime. A general's statue floated down a river, uniforms built from real royal history, a pharaoh's imagery reclaiming a stolen history, a circus painting hiding a secret diary, a riot replayed through a panther's rage, a horror movie confessing what words couldn't, and a bronze emperor standing quietly in a living room nobody was supposed to see. 7 moments, 7 pieces of real history, borrowed and rebuilt, hiding inside the most famous career in pop music. Most critics at the time saw a man obsessed with fame, chasing spectacle for its own sake. But look at what he was actually building, piece by piece, over 20 years. Kings, emperors, ancient pharaohs, monuments meant to outlive the person who built them. Maybe that's the real coincidence. A man terrified of being forgotten and misunderstood while he was alive, quietly building himself into the same kind of symbol that history has never been able to erase. Whatever you believe about Michael Jackson the person, it's hard to deny this. He wasn't just performing music, he was performing history and daring the world to notice. And maybe that's why, more than a decade after his death, people are still standing in front of half-forgotten statues in European parking lots, still arguing over a circus painting, still pausing a horror movie from 1997 to ask, wait, was that actually about him? Most pop stars fade the moment the music stops. Michael Jackson built himself out of the one material history has never fully buried, symbols. And whether the world understood them at the time or not, they're still standing, still being found, still being argued about,